Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for In the Know Live. As we all know, January is such a hectic time of the year, trying to close out last year's tax year and prepare for next year. So our goal today is to help alleviate some of that stress for you. We're going to be talking about W-2s and hopefully give you all the information you need to get those filled out and done on time. As you may recall, if you joined us this time last year, we did a webinar on W-2s then. Some of this information may be a refresher for you, but there's also some new information, so we'll cover that as well and move forward and help you get started in your new year. Let me start by introducing our guest. Art Rhodes is here with us.
I'm the guest today?
You're the guest. You're
good.
Yes. He's the president and CEO of the Church of God Benefits Board, and he's going to walk us through all of this. Art?
Well, thank you, Angie. It is great to be back with you today to talk about something that is critically important and something that really has to be done right. And so today we're going to walk through the W-2. Kind of the idea is to walk you box by box through the W-2 today. I know there's some questions. I think Angie wants to start with a couple of questions, and then we'll just jump right into going step by step through the W-2, making sure that you get it right both for your ministers and for non-ministers, for the staff. So Angie, I know you got questions. Let's get started. We only have a short time, so let's do it.
All right, we'll just hit the ground running with our first question. I came in last week. It says, my pastor is saying that he wants me to give him a 1099 rather than a W-2. What should I do?
Well, I know that there's some people that have joined us that are not Church of God, so we welcome you first of all. But in the Church of God, the way that our church polity is set up, our ministers who are in a pastoral role are considered to be employees of the church. Now, that's critically important to understand because that means that they should be receiving a W-2. Now, there's some denominations that may not actually operate the same way, but if you operate in a hierarchical type system of church governance like we do in the Church of God, then our ministers are going to be considered employees of the local church. Now, it's critical to understand that when we talk about them being employees for tax purposes, a minister has a dual tax status, and you've probably heard about this before, but it's critical to know that a minister for tax purposes, federal income tax purposes, state income tax purposes, is an employee of the church. However, for self-employment purposes or for Social Security and Medicare purposes, they are considered self-employed. So they have this dual crazy tax status. And again, we'll talk about some of that as we get into the W-2s today, but just remember that dual status. And for Church of God ministers, they should be receiving a W-2 and not a 1099. That's critically important. Once we get to the discussion about the housing allowance and other things, you got to remember that a independent contractor, which is entitled to a 1099, would not get a housing allowance. So if you want a housing allowance, you need to be a W-2 employee. So those type of benefits, retirement, housing allowance, accountable reimbursement, which we'll again talk about all those issues a little during our time together today, those are only available to employees. So a minister in our faith tradition in the Church of God should be a W-2 employee, so he's eligible for those type of benefits.
Okay, well, our next question actually concerns the housing allowance. It says, what all goes in box 1 on the pastor's W-2? Do I put his housing allowance in box 1?
Well, I guess that is kind of the whole discussion today. What goes in each box? Does the housing allowance go there? The simple answer is income goes in box 1, taxable income goes in box 1, housing allowance does not. And we'll talk through that and make sure that I answer this question in total. But that really does lead us, and if you don't mind, I'll just go ahead and jump into the W-2s where we're talking about what's on the W-2. And you're going to see this come up on the screen. You won't see me anymore. That's probably good. but you'll see this come up on the screen, and we'll walk through every section of the W-2. So you see the 2016 version of the W-2. This is filled out for a minister in Tennessee. Now again, once we get to the bottom of the W-2, you're going to see some state tax issues that come up. But again, this is for a Tennessee pastor that does not have a state income tax. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is you'll see this particular form in a lot of our publications that are on our website. Again, you saw that on your screen earlier, but benefitsboard.com. If you click on the resource tab and then under manuals, you're going to find a tax manual, you're going to find a minister's compensation manual, and you will find also a treasurer's manual for those of you who are church treasurers. So let's look step by step as to what goes in each box. Now, if you go to some of the websites that talk about how to fill in W-2, and even the IRS instructions, they generally start at box 1 because that's where you start putting the income. But I think it's critical that we start really at the very beginning. Let's start at the genesis of the W-2, and that's box A, because if these boxes, box A through F, if those are not completed properly, then it really doesn't matter what you put in the other boxes, because they're not going to know who the person is or what the employer is. So let's start out with box A, and box A is the employee's Social Security number. So you have to make sure that you know what the minister or employee's correct Social Security number is. And again, this sounds elementary, but it is critically important that that number is correct and that it matches up with what is on the employee's W-4 and I-9. Now, some of you going, well, what in the world is a W-4 and what's an I-9? A W-4 basically tells you what type of withholdings you should have on an employee. A minister can complete a W-4. He is not required to, but he has to do that, or should do that, if he's doing voluntary withholdings. But all, and let me go back, did I say all? I said yes. All employees who receive compensation, that includes ministers, must complete an I-9. And an I-9 simply is a form provided by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement entity that verifies that you are an employee, that you are a citizen, and that you are entitled to work in the U.S. We have seen this issue come up in some church situations recently, where ICE, the Immigration and Customs folks, have questioned churches about people that they're paying. So if you're on staff at a church, you need to complete an I-9. Many of you are familiar with W-9s. Those are used for folks who should be getting 1099s throughout the year. But an I-9, again, is a form to verify who you are and that you're eligible to work in this country. I have to complete one for the Benefits Board every year, and you need to have that on file. So what's on the I-9, what's on the W-4, Social Security number should be matching up. You're also going to get some of the other information that shows up on here, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Box B, so let's move along. I don't want to get bogged down in one topic, but box B, you need to make sure that you are using the correct employer identification number for your church. Not some church across town, not some church, your district church, certainly not your state office, but you should have an employer identification number that is individual for your church. It is basically the Social Security number for your local church. If you do not know what that number is, you need to find that out immediately before completing your W-2s. Box C, This is make sure the name of the employer matches the EIN number. Now, again, sounds simple, but what you need to make sure of, if your church is Victory Tabernacle or Victory Praise or Hallelujah Church of God or whatever, you need to make sure that the name that goes on the W-2 matches up with the name that the EIN was issued to. So some of you may have had an EIN issued to XYZ Church of God, and you're now going by Cathedral of Praise Church of God, or Cathedral of Praise, or whatever name. You need to make sure, if you do that, that the name that the EIN was issued to, XYZ Church of God, doing business as Cathedral of Praise Church, and then the address. But the name that the EIN was issued to should appear in box C. Make sure that that's right. Box D is just a control number. That's generally used for large employers. We don't have that situation most of the time in the church world, so generally it's going to be left blank. Box E is the name of the minister, and you need to make sure that that name matches up with what is on the minister or employee, again, both situations, W-4 and I-9. So in my case, instead of Art Rhodes, my real name, I guess, is Arthur Rhodes. So that's what needs to go on the in box E here, full name as listed on the W-4 and I-9. And then in box F, you need to verify the minister or employee's home address. Now again, that should come off of the W-4 or the I-9. It is critical, though, that if that employee has changed or moved in the last couple of weeks or months, go ahead and change and put the name or their new address on the form. But you need to make sure also that they update their W-4 and their I-9 to coincide with that. Make sure that you put the zip code on there too. It's critically important. So that kind of gets us through the perfunctory part of the W-2, and now we move to where the real income is. And you see kind of the right half of the W-2 on your screen there. Box 1 is critical. And this is all reportable and taxable income goes here. So employees, and this is pretty simple. If they made $100 a week, then $5,200 goes in that box. For ministers, it's a little different. And so you see the question, what is taxable income for ministers? So before we go on with any of the other boxes, I want to talk about this real quick, and you'll see a couple of slides that come up on your screen of what is taxable income. And some of you who have heard me speak before have seen these slides, but it's critical that you pay attention to what is taxable income and what is not taxable income. So we pretty well know without question that salary is taxable income. But the second issue is one that often throws people off, and that's bonuses, love offerings, Christmas gifts, a weekend away for the pastor and his wife or pastor and family. Those are also compensation, and it's taxable income. So there's a value to that, and it must go in box 1 as a part of his taxable income. The other thing you see is Social Security paid by the church. According to S68 of the Church of God Minutes, it suggests that the church pay 1/2 of the minister's Social Security. If you recall, we talked about that Social Security ministers are treated differently and for Social Security purposes, and therefore the church, according to the minutes, should be paying 1/2 of the minister's Social Security. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but that amounts to his total Social Security is 15.3%. The church pays 1/2, it's 7.65%, which puts him basically in the same position as if he were an employee in a regular situation. The problem is when the church, well, I don't guess it's a problem, but it's a benefit. When the church pays that Social Security, then it becomes income to him. So if the church pays $500 towards his Social Security, That's as though he received $500 worth of compensation. You see, business expense reimbursement under a non-accountable plan. Simple example of that is that the church gives the pastor or staff member $50 or $100 a week and says, this is for expenses. If they do not require accountability for how those expenses were spent, then that's a non-accountable plan, and that $100 or $50 or whatever it amounts to becomes taxable income. And then the last item is the personal use of an auto. And this basically comes up when the pastor may take the church van or church vehicle and use it for his own personal use. If he takes it on vacation, for the church van on vacation for a week with his family, there is actually a value of that vehicle, and that has to be included as a part of his taxable income. And I know some of you are saying, Art, this doesn't make sense, and why are you even talking about this? I'm just reporting what the facts are here, folks, and so don't throw stones at me. Again, these are things that have to be recorded as a part of his income. So if we've looked at the things that what are taxable, so what is not taxable? Again, start out with the top one, and you noticed I put it on the top because the benefits board does what? We run the retirement plan. So the best non-taxable income is if the church provides retirement contributions into the minister's retirement plan. Those do not show up anywhere if it is a church contribution. So those don't show up on his W-2 or on the employee's W-2, and it doesn't have to be reported as income. Fringe benefits, such as medical insurance in certain situations, is a non-taxable income. Now, what situations are those? Two. One, if the church has a group health plan, and the church is paying the minister or employee's insurance, then that is a fringe benefit, does not have to be included. The other situation is if the minister is the only employee of the church, then the church could pay his health insurance or reimburse those health insurance costs, and they would not be considered income. Then we talk about business expense under an accountable plan, and this is where the minister is accounting back to the church for his expenses. There's a resolution in place, and again, we don't have time to talk about all this, but there is a true accountable plan in place, and if there's any overage after the church has provided for expenses, then that is reimbursed back to the church. In that situation, it is not income. And then housing allowance. We talked about the dual status of the minister. Housing allowance is not considered income for tax liability, but it is considered income for Social Security. So again, this is where the dual tax status shows up as a big issue. So just quick run through there. I'm going to move through these other boxes quickly just to make sure that you have an understanding, but box 2 is where there would be federal withholding for any amounts that has been withheld on an employee for taxes, for federal income taxes, would be reported in box 2. In the example that we have used here, there were no federal withholding. So what was happening, the minister was on a quarterly basis, hopefully, was paying his tax liability through the use of a form 1040 ES. He was making those estimated tax payments, so the church was not withholding anything. Now, if the church were withholding in a voluntary situation, the minister in this situation could have taxes in box 2. Now again, the minister has to voluntarily agree for that to happen. If this were a church secretary or a janitor who was not in a ministerial role, then there would have to be federal withholdings there that met what the W-4 was telling the church secretary or church treasurer to withhold here. So federal tax withholdings, again, can be voluntary for ministers, but if not, nothing would go there. And then boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6, you see there is nothing in those boxes. Again, this is a minister, and for a minister of the gospel, those boxes are not completed for ministers. They should not be completed. A minister does not have, that basically covers FICA wages, does not have those withholdings done, because remember, he is that dual status taxpayer. So he's paying those taxes outside through the normal quarterly process. If he wanted, he could have over federal income taxes withheld, but if he does that, all of that would appear in box 2, nothing in box 3, 4, 5, or 6. Now, Social Security wages generally for an employee is going to be the same amount as what's in box 1, unless he has salary reduction, and I'll come back and talk about that momentarily. So normally Social Security wages would be $40,000 in this situation if this were an employee. On Social Security, the person in 2016 has to pay Social Security, which is 6.2% on all wages up to $118,500. And that number will vary every year going forward. So you need to make sure what that number is. Now, to be perfectly honest, we generally don't have to worry about that in the church world, simply because most of our folks are not making that much money. But then Social Security taxes, again, would be 6.2% reported in box 4 of what is in box 3, the wages. Box 5 is Medicare. Again, generally it would be the same amount as box 1. The Medicare tax is 1.45%. And if you made $1 million, you would still have to pay the 1.45% of the Medicare taxes. Of course, if you are making $1 million, I will give you my cell number. Call me, because I'd like to have your job. We could maybe job share or job switch, something like that. I'd be really interested in that. Again, all joking aside, that's an issue we normally don't deal with, those kind of numbers in the church world. Our next screen takes us to all the way down through box 12. 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. I can go through real quickly there, because generally you're not going to see those boxes checked or anything in them in a church situation. We get to box 12. As you know, it's kind of a multi-box there of different things that could go in there. The 2 things that you should be aware of is, and you see in this situation, there is an E code that is for a 403B salary reduction amounts. So that's contributing to the minister's retirement plan. So in this case, that E code is for the minister, in this case, having from his part of his compensation money withheld. So theoretically, had he not had that $6,000 withheld, box 1 would be $46,000. Now, I mentioned earlier, a minister does not have to pay Social Security or Medicare on that $6,000 that's showing up there. If this were a non-minister, box 3 would show $46,000, even though box 1 is $40,000 and the non-minister had withheld $6,000 for salary reduction. Box 6, a non-minister still has to pay Social Security, and box 5 would be $46,000 as well. Non-ministers have to pay Medicare on even their salary reduction, where ministers do not. So remember that E code, and there's a lot more information on our website about these issues. Code D, our code double D here for box 12 is if you have a group health care plan, the IRS now says you've got to report that using a code DD. Very quickly, just completing kind of about the form here, box 13, you would check box 13 if the person is participating in the retirement plan. The other 2 boxes generally are not applicable in the church world. And this checking the retirement plan box would be whether the person was doing salary reduction or whether or not the person was, or the church was contributing on their behalf. Box 14 is basically the other box. It's an informational box. It is stuff that is not included in box 1 income. And here we have the minister's housing allowance. If the minister were living in a parsonage and had the same amount in the parsonage fair value was $12,000, then you would report that amount here as well. Again, box 14 is kind of the information. Are you required to do that? No, but it is suggested by the IRS. And then, as I mentioned, box 15 through 20 down at the bottom of the page is for state employee number, wages, and other things. These boxes are not filled in on this sheet simply because this is a Tennessee minister and there's no state income tax, but you would need to fill those in based upon what is required by your state law. So that's a quick run through, Angie. I know that that you have some other questions that have come in as we're talking, and you may have other questions that come in later, but I'll take a breath and let you ask the question.
Okay, thank you so much for covering that so thoroughly for us. And as you mentioned while you were talking, we did have some additional questions come in from our viewers. So if we've got a few minutes, let's try to hit as many of those as we can.
Okay.
First one is, as a church, we've always given our pastor a 1099 at the end of the year. Why can't we just continue to do that and not have to worry about a W-2?
Well, and I go back to what I said earlier, and that is a 1099 is for a person who's an independent contractor. A minister, you don't want to be in that situation because you don't get any of the benefits. You don't get a housing allowance. You don't get an accountable reimbursement plan. So while you may have been doing that in the past, you need to move to a W-2 so the minister is entitled to those benefits that come with an employee status.
Okay, thank you. As a church, I'm sorry, the next question is, we've hired a youth pastor that doesn't have a ministerial credential. However, he is living in the parsonage. How do we treat the value of that parsonage for him? Can we just designate it as parsonage allowance in box 14?
Well, I wish you could. And I actually had this question this week come up where in a situation, one church had a couple of ministers who were on staff that did not get their credentials until December at the end of the year. And in that situation, if they provided housing allowance prior to that period of time, prior to the person getting credentials, then that's just pure income. You cannot be designated as housing allowance. So they got to treat it differently. In our situation, again, Church of God, you are a minister once you get credentials, and once you get that credentials, meaning you get that little certificate saying, here's my ministerial file number. So,
okay, this church makes a contribution to their pastor's retirement account at the benefits board. He doesn't have anything withheld from his paycheck for retirement. Where do we report this on the church's contribution on the W-2?
This is the easiest question of all. Simply nowhere. If the church is making the whole contribution, whether it's 5%, 10%, or whatever the number is, if the church is making that whole contribution, it doesn't have to be reported anywhere. If the pastor is doing that out of salary reduction, then it shows up in box 12. However, if the church is making that contribution, remember that little check box that we had, box 13? That box needs to be checked, even though the church is the only one making the contribution, but he doesn't have to pay taxes on it. And that applies to a minister and a non-minister as well.
Wonderful. Okay, and this may be our last question. The church provides a pastor a cell phone. How do we treat the cell phone bill for tax purposes?
Again, I love this question because it's simple. You don't have to worry about it. Up until a couple of years ago, churches had to calculate what was business use of the cell phone, what was not business use. And again, I think now 4 or 5 years ago, the IRS said, okay, we're not going to worry about that anymore because cell phones have become so inexpensive and were so prevalent, then we just said, don't worry about it. So with cell phones, you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Very good. Well, I know we're out of time here, but everybody's always interested in your top 10 list of tips. Do we have time to run through those right quick?
We'll run through them real quick. I'm going to do top 10 things that you should see and I should deal with. Number one, You've got to provide the W-2 by no later than January 31. And this is a big change. The W-2, which is transmitted by the W-3, has to go to the IRS and to Social Security Administration by January 31. That's a new change. It must be filed by January 31, not by February, end of March, as it used to be. Second thing, you can obtain blank W-2 forms from your local IRS office. You can get them from office supply stores. You can get them from the post office. You can call the toll-free number. You're probably out of time on that to get them through the IRS, sending them to you. The easiest way is to go online and complete them. There's a secure site. You see that, socialsecurity.gov/employer/. It allows you to complete the W-2 on there, print it out, give it to the employee, and also file your W-3 all at the same time. I would highly encourage you to do that. Number 3, make sure that you don't include dollar signs when you're putting numbers in there. Also, don't include commas, but do use decimal points and cents. So you see the example of how $1,000 should look. Number 4, if a box on the W-2 does not apply, just leave it blank. Don't put anything there. Number 5, check the retirement box in 13 only if the minister or the church-related employee is participating in a recognized retirement plan. That's back to the situation that we just talked about. Number 6, make sure they can read it. Make sure the ink is good, the print's not too small, and that it is legible. Again, if you use the electronic system, it's the best way to go. Number 7, the wages and tax report in box 1 through 6 must balance with what was on your Form 941s. If they don't, the easiest way is print them out. We talk about that in number 8, practical tip. Print out the last pay stub. Print out your 4 941s. Make sure that the W-2s match up. Number 9, remember that love offerings and bonuses are reportable income and must be included in box 1 for all employees, including ministers. Number 10, I go back to what I said in number 1. Remember that the W-3s and the Form 1096s, which transmit 1099s, must now be filed by January 31, not by the end of February or the end of March. The other thing that I would just point out, I guess this is number 10 or number 11, is if you haven't heard, the new reimbursable mileage rate for this year is 53.5 cents a mile. That is down from 54 cents a mile last year. So I know we're over, but and we covered a lot of information here.
We did go over a little bit, but thank you so much for taking your time to help us through this very critical form and get it done appropriately. We did have some questions that came in that we were not able to address, and I would like to invite each of you, if you did not get your question covered, to email us. The email address is webinar@benefitsboard.com. Also, you can go to our website, as Art mentioned several times. There are manuals and other information there. That website address is benefitsboard.com. We also have a blog site, which is benefitsboard@wordpress.com. Art, thank you once again, and thank each of you for taking your time to join us today. And just stay tuned. We'll have information on our next webinar coming up soon. Thanks so much.
Y'all have a blessed day. Great to be with you.